Okay. Okay, so thank you everyone so much for being here today. My name's Erin. I'm the patient support manager and healthcare manager at Craig's Cause Pancreatic Cancer Society. We're really lucky to be joined today by Dawn Richards. She's the founder of 502 Labs Incorporated and the director of patient and public engagement at Clinical Trials Ontario. She has a PhD in analytical chemistry from the University of Alberta and experience in a variety of roles over the past 20 years. It is her diagnosis with rheumatoid arthritis in 2006 that started her journey to combine her passion for science with making the most of her diagnosis. In her role at CTO, Dawn is charged with executing on CTO's strategic pillar of patient and public engagement. So thank you so much for being here today, Dawn. Without further ado, I will hand it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Erin. And I just wanted to say it's really a pleasure for me to spend part of my Saturday with all of you. I know it's the last day of Pancreatic Cancer Awareness Month. And I know for some of you joining from the US, it's your Thanksgiving weekend as well. So I wanted to wish you happy Thanksgiving. So I'm going to share some slides with you. And I also wanted to let you know that Erin has provided me in advance with some of the types of questions that you're interested in. And a lot of those should be answered through the talk. And I'll try and make sure that that's obvious for you, but really happy for you to type anything in the chat, although I might not see it while I'm going through the presentation, but I'll definitely come back to it. And we'll have some time for questions also at the end of things. I wanted to say too that it's not my job to push you towards clinical trials, but what my job is to provide you with information so you can make an informed decision for yourself about potentially participating in trials or not. That's completely a personal decision that's up to you. I also wanted to let you know that this is what we're going to cover today in the talk. We'll talk about some of the basics about clinical trials so you can kind of feel comfortable with why they're designed, what they're designed to do, and maybe those things called phases, what they are. We'll talk about finding a clinical trial. There's different ways to do that. And we'll give you kind of some basic information too about participating in clinical trials or even leaving a clinical trial if you've started to be in one. So you have lots of rights, you have lots of responsibilities as a clinical trial participant, and hopefully those become clear to you over the next, I think, 35 or 40 minutes or so. I also wanted to let you know that while I work for an organization called Clinical Trials Ontario, everything that I'm going to talk to you about today is applicable all over Canada. So clinical trials are federally regulated by Health Canada. So anything that I talk about is applicable all over Canada. And a lot of it is applicable for those of you who are in the US as well. So kind of like the basics are pretty much the same between Canada and the US. Just briefly, Clinical Trials Ontario, or CTO, has been set up and it's mostly funded by the government of Ontario, basically to help the environment in Ontario in which to do trials. And we have these 3 strategic priorities. As Erin mentioned, the one that I lead is about engaging patients and the public. And that means doing things like today, so helping you be informed about clinical trials and helping you make the right decision for you. It also means helping patients and public partners and researchers and clinicians work together to actually design better trials that are more relevant for you as individuals who are interested in trials. So everything that I'm going to talk about today, and I can share these links with you at another time too, but I've also put a QR code up if you want to snap it with your camera. We've got a lot of information on our website. It's available in English and French, and we have worked with patient partners to actually develop that information for you. Some of them themselves have been in clinical trials. Some of them are caregivers. Some of them are just interested in trials and helping provide credible and evidence-based information to people to help them make decisions. So if you want to go back and look at anything, it can all be found on the CTO website. So let's talk about the basics of clinical trials to start off with. So what are they in the first place? It's important to know that clinical trials are a type of research, and they are a type of research that involves people. Sometimes people are in clinical trials to access new therapies, but important to know that they're still usually experimental therapies. They test what's called health-related interventions. Intervention's a fancy word for therapy or treatment. So they test health-related treatments and they look at the outcomes that those treatments may provide. And you'll see as we walk through the different types of clinical trials, we design clinical trials to answer really specific questions. And some of those questions might be, is the treatment safe? Does it improve or cure a disease? Or maybe it helps people live longer than other treatments. And maybe it gives people a better quality of life. Maybe it helps them feel better as well. So those are some of the questions that clinical trials can answer. We often think about drugs being part of clinical trials, and we're kind of going to focus on that path a bit throughout the talk. But clinical trials can be designed to look at other types of interventions as well. And those things might be done on their own, or they might be done in combination with something. So we'll kind of focus on the drug end just to keep things simple today. But trials can also be used to test medical devices. Maybe you could think of like an insulin pump or a pacemaker that's been through a clinical trial. It might be a new type of surgery, might be a type of radiation therapy. It might be some other diagnostic procedure, maybe that involves some type of imaging. And it can even be things like diet and lifestyle. So might be, a specific nutritional supplement, or maybe it's an exercise trial. So clinical trials can study lots of different things. And again, we'll focus more on the drug end today to just kind of keep things simple. So we do clinical trials to gather data, and you'll hear me talk a bit throughout the talk about designing things a certain way so that results are cleaner or they're unbiased. And so really we're trying to collect the best data or evidence possible about a treatment. And that evidence then helps a whole bunch of different people decide what therapies might work best for people. So it might be physicians using the evidence from clinical trials, for example, to develop clinical practice guidelines, so treatment guidelines. It might be policymakers using the evidence from clinical trials to decide what kinds of things will be included and available, for example, to people in different provinces in Canada, or maybe it will help determine if things will be covered in different provinces. Helps researchers to decide if they're going to continue working on a therapy or what direction they take it in. And it helps people like Health Canada also look at the evidence and make decisions too. So lots of different people can use the data that's generated by clinical trials for different reasons. So as I mentioned, we'll talk a bit about the phases of clinical trials for drugs, and this is to help you understand a little bit more about the types of questions that are answered by clinical trials. And it's also important to understand that, well, something might start off in phase one, depending on the results from that phase one study, it may or may not proceed on to other phases for a whole bunch of different reasons. But this is kind of a snapshot, and we'll walk through each of these different phases as well and go over things a little bit more. And you can see basically the phases are designed. Initially, the phase one studies are done in a smaller number of people, so they typically take less time. than as the later phases, which typically involve many more people and sometimes can go on for years. So I'll walk you through what each of those different phases looks like and why those different phases happen. So let's start off with phase 1 clinical trials. These are usually done in a small number of people. The numbers here are kind of a guide. In rare diseases, there might be even fewer people, and sometimes the phases for these might be combined, again, depending on the disease area and whatnot. So this is just kind of an overall guide. Phase 1 studies, you might hear them called first in human studies because that's what they are. Sometimes they're done in so-called healthy participants, but often in oncology, phase 1 studies are done in patients when there aren't a lot of other options that are available. But in phase 1, the aim really is to establish the safety of the intervention. And you can also keep in mind too that before things go into a phase 1 study, they've often been studied for many years in the lab. They've been studied in different cells. They've been studied in different types of animal models. And there's a good sense of how these things should behave in people, but we actually don't know until the therapy goes into people how safe it actually is. So there's lots of evidence that's generated before a phase 1 study about the treatment. But again, we don't know, and it's an experimental treatment in clinical trials. So we're looking at the safety. We're often looking at the best dose to give people. And throughout the different phases of clinical trials, researchers are always looking at the side effect information about the drug in this case. So depending on what the phase 1 results look like, our hypothetical drug may or may not go on to a phase 2 study. And again, that can be for a whole bunch of different reasons, but we'll assume that it's met its so-called endpoints for the study, and whoever's running the study has decided that they're going to take it to a phase 2 study. So a phase 2 study, there's a good understanding of the safety of the molecule and information about the dose. Phase 2 studies generally involve more people than phase 1 studies. And here they are about making sure that the treatment does what it's supposed to do. That's basically efficacy. So does it do what we think it's supposed to do? And the researchers continue to learn more about and really hone in on the dose that should be given to people. And again, they're always collecting information about the side effects. And as you put it into more people, sometimes you'll discover more about the different side effects that, in our case, this hypothetical drug has. So we'll say again that our hypothetical drug is going to continue on to the next phase of the clinical trial kind of pipeline, and that's called phase 3 clinical trials. These are generally in larger numbers of people, maybe thousands of people, but depends on the disease. It may not be thousands of people. Here, the researchers are really looking to see how long the effects of this therapy last. They are continuing to learn more about the dose that's given and always looking at the side effect information. These are for larger numbers of participants, and you may hear, or you may have heard the term randomized control trials. Those are phase 3 studies. So a randomized clinical trial is when you're comparing 2 or more interventions or treatment arms to each other. So one would be the experimental therapy, and one might be the typical standard of care that people with this particular disease or condition experience. So they're called randomized because people are assigned by chance to one of those treatment arms. And as I mentioned quite a few slides ago, participants are randomized so that we can reduce the chance of bias. So sometimes the clinical trial team doesn't even know who's in which arm. Sometimes they do, and there's different reasons for that as well. But if you hear randomized clinical trial or RCT, that's a phase 3 study. At this point in Canada, the sponsor of the study, so the group that's funding the study, if the results look good from the phase 3 study, they can apply to Health Canada for that data to be used for them to actually bring this, in our case, this hypothetical drug to market and make it more widely available to people in Canada. So phase 4 clinical trials are when something is widely available on the market. And that's when our hypothetical drug at this point is going into many hundreds or maybe even thousands of people. They are sometimes referred to as post-marketing surveillance studies, and that's because after phase 3 studies, the sponsor is allowed to so-called market this therapy. And so they continue to monitor side effects and things that happen in people after this becomes widely available and it's been approved by our regulator, Health Canada. So this helps study long-term side effects, and these might be side effects that haven't been as pronounced in some of the trials to this point. And there are classic examples of things coming to market, but once they've come to market, larger side effects are seen in the population. Sometimes they've been removed from the market, or the dose has changed, or there are various other outcomes that happen. So again, very large number of participants because at this point, our hypothetical drug is really widely available. So sometimes I get asked about placebo and people ask what a placebo is. So important for you to know that a placebo is an inactive therapy that basically looks exactly like the active therapy. So if the experimental treatment is a small white pill, the placebo would look identical to it. So you wouldn't know as a participant which one you're getting, and you would have no reason to believe you're getting one or the other. It's not intended to have any effect on the condition that's being studied. And so that's so that things can be compared directly to placebo. So again, placebo is another one of these things, just like randomization, where it's used to make the results of the study more reliable. So it's easier to compare things and understand what the actual effect of the intervention is. But also really important to know that a placebo is only used if there's no so-called standard of care for a condition or disease. So it would not be ethical in a clinical trial for someone who is on a standard of care to be given a placebo. So that would not happen in a trial. So if there is a so-called standard of care for a condition or disease, then in randomized trials, typically the standard of care arm is compared to the experimental therapy arm, and that's your comparator. Okay, so that kind of wraps up the basics of clinical trials and some of the questions that they are designed to answer. Next, I'm going to move on to how do you actually find a clinical trial if you're interested in doing so. And I know Erin's already mentioned that Craig's Cause has a great kind of service that they provide. If you're interested in finding a trial, there are some other things out there as well for you. So you might choose to talk to, if you have a specialist or a healthcare provider, they may have different levels of knowledge about trials. In the oncology space, quite frankly, they tend to be quite knowledgeable about trials because that's often part of treatment pathways, even though that these are experimental therapies. Obviously, you could go to Craig's Cause or other health charities or patient organizations. They often will have different information about clinical trials. You could also contact a hospital or an organization that does research that you know is in the space you're interested in. They will often have people to help you find a trial at their site. You may have heard ads on the newspaper, TV, or radio. Those can be legitimate ads for clinical trials as well. And then we've developed a clinical trial finder that you can find on our website. It looks at trials that are in Canada, and you can search based on your postal code and how far away you want to be, or you can search by different provinces. It uses a larger clinical trial database called clinicaltrials.gov, and it just pulls out the information related to Canada. And it's a little less intimidating than what clinicaltrials.gov looks like. But clinicaltrials.gov has clinical trials from all over the world that are registered in it that you can look in. And our finder is really based on Canadian trials. So those are some of the ways that you might find a trial. There's lots of questions to ask if you're concerned about the legitimacy of a trial. And so these are some of them. You should ask about the costs of the trial being covered. You should not be asked to pay for the study treatment. That's a big red flag. Or like some kind of entrance fee for the trial. That's another big red flag. But all of the costs of the trial may not be covered. Like you might have to pay for some parking, you might have to pay to take, or you might have to take time off work. But those are questions you should be asking. And a couple of those things are red flags if you're asked, for example, to pay for the study treatment. You should also scrutinize the qualifications of the clinical trial team. So are these people who do research in this area, or have they practiced in this area for many years? Are they reputable? Have they written papers on things? Those are things you should do your homework on. All clinical trials in Canada have to be reviewed and approved by our regulator, Health Canada. And that is a question that you can ask if that's the case. All clinical trials also have to be approved by a research ethics board in Canada. And that is another completely legitimate question for you to ask if you've been offered a study, or if you are looking into who is doing the study and you'd like to ask some questions. And lastly, the clinical trials that happen in Canada have to be reviewed and approved by the institution or organization where they're happening. So those institutions, have a degree of liability with running those studies at their sites. And so they have to review and approve and be okay with that. So there's lots of different, kind of steps to approval to run a clinical trial. There's lots of different qualifications that people should have. And obviously, there are a few other things you should look at to determine if a trial is reputable or credible. Sometimes people ask, how do I know if a trial is the right one for me? And that's up to you. That's your personal decision to make with people whose opinions you value and trust, which might be a healthcare provider, might be your family, might be someone from Craig's Cause. That's really a personal decision that's up to you. But the way that we suggest people look at it as a start is the exact same things we had on the last slide. And the other thing to note too is even if you're interested in a trial, you will have to meet what's called the eligibility criteria to be in the trial. And that's kind of like a list of things that you have to meet to actually be in the study, and that's designed by the study team. So maybe you might have to be a certain age range. Maybe you can't have taken a certain type of medication already. Those things will be listed, and you'll have to make sure that you meet those. And usually the study team will kind of do like a pre-screen with you to make sure that you in fact are eligible to participate in the trial. There's probably lots of other questions for you to ask too that are super personal, and some of those we'll go through as well. But you know, determining if a trial is a good fit for you probably includes the kind of time it's going to take, like where it's located, how much out-of-pocket cost there might be. And we've got lots of those questions on our website as well to help you brainstorm some of those things you might think about asking the study team if you get to that stage. There are other options. Clinical trials aren't the only option, and each of these options comes with potential benefits and risks too. So, one option is receiving no treatment, which may or may not feel like an option for you. One might be receiving a different form of standard treatment than what you're currently on, and maybe it's participating in a different research study. And these things might all be good things to discuss with a healthcare provider or someone that you trust before you make any of these kinds of decisions. If you can't find a trial, there may be other options. So there may be the possibility to look into if there's a trial at another location. So maybe it's not where you live, but maybe it's not far down the highway, or maybe it is, to be quite frank with you. I do know people who have traveled to different cities in Canada to participate in trials. I know someone right now who's participating in a study in the US, and they go down once a month to participate in the study. And sometimes some of the studies will cover your travel costs. And so those are things to look into. If it's not in a location that's close to you, is there the possibility for you to still be in it? And if that's the case, how does that affect you? Does that require out of pocket, finances? What kind of time? All those kinds of things. Again, one of the people who I know is going to the U.S. right now for a trial has found a way for some of her tests to be done in Canada, and they send the results to the trial site in the U.S. So again, there's lots of different options, but they're going to affect you in different ways. And so those are important questions for you to ask. There may be ways to bring trials closer to you, like maybe there's the possibility for a site close to you to actually open up a study. I'm not saying that this might not take work, but I do know people who have advocated and had that happen where they've brought studies closer to them than what they would have otherwise been possible. And then I do know people too who have kept up to date on the research, and they've watched, for example, a study in the US open up. And within a few months, it's been at sites in Canada, and then they've been able to participate in Canada. So just because you can't find a trial at the moment that's close to you, I wouldn't suggest forgetting about it. I'd still continue to ask lots of questions and see what the possibilities are for you, if that's of interest to you. So there was a question about whether or not you have to take a trial that you found to your healthcare provider, or if you have to go through your healthcare provider to participate in a trial. And the answer to that is no. You don't have to do that, but it's probably a good idea for you to talk to your healthcare provider about a study that you are interested in. And at the same time, if a healthcare provider offers you the chance to participate in a clinical trial and you don't feel it's right for you, you do not have to say yes to that. So again, to come back to the idea that This is a really personal decision that's up to you. And so your healthcare provider should be able to understand why you've made that choice. And it shouldn't impact your healthcare. Um, so that's just important to know that you shouldn't feel pressured. And really, this is a very personal decision for you to make. Okay, so next I'm going to talk a little bit about participating or even leaving a clinical trial if at some point you change your mind about participation, whatever that reason is. So the first thing to talk about, and you may have heard of this concept of informed consent, and people usually think, oh yeah, I've heard about that long form that you read and you have to sign. But informed consent is more than just the informed consent form. It's actually a process that happens throughout your time in the study. And so the informed consent form is part of that. And so is asking lots of questions all throughout the study. Important to know that you participating in a clinical trial and providing your consent to do so is voluntary. So it's totally up to you whether or not you make the choice to participate in a trial. Even if you do decide to participate in a trial, you can withdraw your consent at any time for any reason. And we'll talk a bit more about that. And then, as I mentioned, consent is this ongoing process. So you should always feel free to ask questions about the trial while you're in it. Make sure that you understand things if you have any questions. And the team should also be providing you with information throughout the study as well. If you do decide to leave a clinical trial at any time, you can request that your data be removed from the study data. And if you provided any kinds of biological samples, you can ask that those are withdrawn too. And for a number of reasons, the trial team may or may not be able to grant you that request, but it's something that you can definitely ask. So potential benefits and risks of trials. Again, this is part of your personal decision where you need to weigh the potential benefits against the potential risks of being in a clinical trial. The potential and benefits and risks will be different for each trial because there's different experimental therapies in them, and that will all be described for you in the informed consent form. So you should ask lots of questions about those potential benefits and risks from the study team, and keep asking those questions until you feel like you're okay with the information that you have, that it's clear to you, that it's understandable to you, and that you can make a decision based on that information. You should, for example, be provided the informed consent form and be able to take it away, read it, mark it up, bring it back, and ask lots of questions too. So this isn't informed consent isn't just you get handed a piece of paper and you're expected to make a decision right away. So what happens if you decide, even after you've signed up and you're participating in a clinical trial, that you would like to leave the trial? And again, this is your decision to make for any reason. So you can make that decision and you don't have to provide the trial team with your reason for withdrawing. They might ask you, and you might feel comfortable letting them know what that is, but that's okay if you don't want to share that with them. We really do encourage people, if that's the direction they're headed in, to contact the study doctor and the staff about your decision. Ask lots of questions, ask what withdrawal involves, and involve them in providing you information so that you can make that informed decision about participation. The team before you leave might ask you some questions about your experience in the trial, and you might actually have to undergo some lab tests or physical exams to make sure that you can stop the trial safely. So, it might not just be like, I'm done with the trial, I'm going to walk away from it. It's a good idea to ask the study team what leaving involves. And there might be some tests and some other things that happen. And that's for your own safety. And just like on the last slide, you may be able to ask for the data that was collected from you and any samples that were collected from you to be removed from the trial data as well. But again, that may or may not be possible. So that really wraps it up for me. As I mentioned earlier, this is where you can find basically everything that I just talked about and more. For example, there's lots of questions there for you to ask a study team or to get you thinking about the questions that you might want to ask. There's lots more information there too, based on like where you are in terms of making your decisions. So it's kind of laid out that like you're thinking about a trial, here's some of the things you might think about. You found a trial, here's some of the questions you might ask. You're in a trial, this is what you might expect. And then when you're finished the trial, these are some of the things that might impact you or you might think about as well. And again, I can put the link for this in the chat as we wrap things up. And I've also got my email address for you here. So I don't know about you, but I tend to have like great questions come to me about 10 minutes after we log off the webinar. So I'm more than happy for you to either send questions to Erin or send questions directly to me, and I can help you get them answered. And with that, I'm going to pass things back to Erin, and I'll see if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask or any discussion that you'd like to have.
Thank you so much, Dawn. That was great. That's a ton of really great information that I know for sure I get a lot of questions on regularly. So that really helps to answer a lot of questions. It was really thorough. So thank you so much for that. That was great. Uh,
Thanks.
yeah. Does anyone have any questions for Dawn?
Oh, that's a really good question. I'm not sure I can actually answer that because part of it really depends on what the phase of the trial is, or what the design of the trial looks like. So it really depends a lot on those two things. So that would be a great question, Sarah, for you to ask if you're interested in participating in a trial. Yeah, that's a good question. That information, again, would be part of the inclusion or exclusion criteria to participate. So that would probably be made pretty clear about what someone's kind of history would have to be in order to participate. So again, I would say if you found a trial that you're interested in, that would be something you could talk, like you can contact the study team and ask them any and all questions that you have. Yeah.
Jana asked, does your oncologist have to submit your name or can you register yourself for a trial?
Yeah, you can self-determine that you would like to be in a trial. So, that's totally up to you if you'd like to explore that. Your oncologist isn't like the gatekeeper here that you have to go through, but I would suggest that, you have a conversation with them about what your thoughts are and why you're interested, and ask them any and all questions. They might be familiar with the study or they might be able to help you out with some things, but no, you don't have to go through your healthcare team to participate in a trial. That's completely up to you.
Great. That's really good to know. That's something that comes up a lot, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I think most people would love for their healthcare provider to be aligned with them in terms of participation, because I think that makes it probably easier with your relationship with them. But I have known individuals who have disagreed with their healthcare providers about participation, and they've made up their own decision to participate in trials without the kind of blessing of their healthcare provider. And, that obviously creates some of its own tensions. But again, I can't stress this enough. This is a really personal decision. that you might look to your healthcare provider for guidance on or answering questions about. But that's your decision to make, really. That's an excellent question that I've never had before, Steph. I think it would probably depend on the type of trial, to be honest with you. Like I'm going to imagine being on two drug trials at the same time would probably not happen, but maybe you would be in a trial about a drug and maybe something related to mental health or something like that. So I think it really depends on what's being studied in the trial. Again, it would be if you're in a trial and you're interested in another one, that would be something to ask the trial team about.
Ed asked what percentage of trials have positive results that make it to standard of care, and how long does it take?
Oh, that is a good question that I don't have a quick answer for. And how long does it take? Also another good question I don't have the answer for, but these are generally not, like well, that's not true. I'm going to say, for example, the COVID vaccines, that's an example of something that came fairly quickly and was made available really fast. That's not typical for a clinical trial at all. They tend to take at least a few years. Most things, I can tell you that most things that start out as a phase 1 study don't make it to market. So it's a very tenuous, kind of pathway to things becoming widely available. So I'm sorry, Ed, I kind of gave you a roundabout response, but that's the kind of information I have at my fingertips that I could give you. That's an excellent question.
Are there any other questions? I think Kathy might still be typing, so we'll hang on for that. No worries, take
She's
your time.
saying, just a second.
No problem.
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay.
there is. I have a neuroendocrine pancreatic cancer, which I'm told is rather rare. The good news is it's more treatable than the typical pancreatic cancer, but the
Mm.
bad news is many oncologists aren't experienced in treating it. How do I find a clinical trial for this specific cancer?
So I think again, I would suggest, Kathy, that you reach out to Aaron's colleagues at Craig's Cause because it's so specific. They might be able to help you out with kind of zoning in on it, on what it is, and finding some answers for you. Yeah.
Definitely. I'm going to actually just add the link for our clinical trial finder in the chat here. There we go. Um, so Kathy and Heather, if you're interested in looking into it, or anybody else, of course, too, there's the link there in the chat, so you can fill out the application. Um, yeah, and Dawn, did you want us to link yours as well?
Sure, if you'd like to. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, there's yours. Perfect.
Yep.
Oh,
Our clinical trial finder, I can find the exact, if you can just give me 1 minute,
yeah.
I'm
No,
on it, so I can share the exact link with you too. But
perfect.
chances are, like, this would help you just look for an overview of things, but honestly, if Craig's Cause has a nice tailored kind of resource for you, I'd really encourage you to use it because they'll have expertise and really be able to help you find something.
Totally. Totally. Okay, that's great. Are there any other questions? um, that helped answer a lot of the really fundamental questions that we get asked a lot. So this was really, really helpful, and definitely I think will help guide and definitely be a good resource for the future. So thank you so much again, Dawn, for taking your time on your Saturday. We really appreciate it.
Thanks
Um,
for having me.